Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Eric Davis, continuing our conversations, almost a decade's worth, about the cultures of consciousness. I just finished giving a talk yesterday at the Consciousness Hacking Conference here in San Francisco, the intersection of psychedelics, meditation, and technology. It was a great time. I really enjoyed it. It was not only a lot of interesting folks, but it was well structured such that I was able to go through an entire day at a conference, participating in every event, and it was all scheduled, lunchtime, breakout groups, whatever. There was always something to do. And I managed to make it to the end of the day not feeling like a burned out husk. So that alone says that these guys have their finger on the pulse on how to navigate this kind of stuff. But then almost immediately, I'm turning around and looking at another excellent conference that I'm looking forward to in 2 weeks' time, which is great. I get a little bit more time. And this is the upcoming Queering Psychedelics Conference, also in San Francisco. And this is sponsored by Shakruna and my pal Bia Labachi, who's been on the show before. I'm super psyched about this conference, and I'm honored and somewhat awkwardly so that I'm participating in it as a longtime queer fan, but a demographically straight person. I'm taking on the topic of presenting some of the histories of queer psychedelic counterculture, which is, just as a counterculture historian, I've always been interested in, have a lot of experience with folks and blah, blah, blah. So it's really wonderful stuff, and I'm really happy to be participating in what, to my mind, is an extremely important conversation, because it's not just the sort of psychedelic scene, psychedelic discourse in the last year or two is really transformed, and like a lot of things going on right now, there's a lot of questions about social justice, about identity issues, about power, about capitalism, and so it's another zone where we're wrestling with these things. And what I'm particularly keen about with the Queering Psychedelics is that it's not just about issues of representation, issues of appropriate care. Is there privilege in psychedelic healing modalities? Is there enough room being made for minority perspectives, including sexual and gender minorities? So there's that political angle that a lot of the speakers are talking to. But to me, there's also not only the historical thing that I'm interested in presenting on, but I guess I'd call it an ontological problem. Like, is there something, to me, psychedelics are inherently queering in the broad sense of the term, as well as to some degree the narrow sense of the term. I think that a lot of psychedelic cultures, at least in the West, modern West, have not only embraced queer people and been led by them in many cases, and that's one of the things I'm talking about, but has sort of produced a general queering of not just sexual orientation or ideas of pleasure or ideas of who or what can be a object or fellow subject of eroticism or love, but just a kind of embrace of all of the meanings of that term, of enchantment and weirdness and the kind of twist away from the norm. So it feels to me like it's a conference and a topic that gets to layer some of these mystical meanings or ontological meanings on top of some very pertinent historical and political issues that are very germane today as psychedelic science is exploding and all the things about are going down very rapidly. There's going to be some great speakers there. I'm looking forward particularly to Tony Moss, who's going to be talking about the music side of these things, and one of the most significant currents of queer psychedelic counterculture has to do with music and dance music, which is some juicy history that I'm really enjoying boning up on now. And also Steve Silberman is going to be presenting, an old friend of mine, lives in my neighborhood, one of the great writers and chroniclers of the Grateful Dead, an excellent journalist and an author of a wonderful book on autism. He's done great, and I had to lure him into the festival. He's like, I don't know, they're not really paying enough. I'm a professional, I'm into freelancer, and I was like, man, you got to do it. So I was happy, and Bia convinced him as well. And then another talk that I'm really looking forward to, and as a way of sort of introducing the conference and using that as a good opportunity to do a show, is Dr. Alex Belser, who's going to do a talk on a queer critique of the psychedelic mystical experience. So I saw that title, I'm like, yes, because I have this whole religious studies thing about how the ideas of what mystical experience is that are used in the sociological formats and psychological questionnaires that they use in the Hopkins study and whatever are based on very peculiar, particular, very historical ideas of what mystical experience is that I can totally deconstruct, like that. And I'm like, what's going on with this thing? And so here's Alex taking this on, not just as someone who's, thinking about these things, but actually participating in these studies. Because as I went into his biography, I was like, oh my God, this guy's like working on all the most interesting research from my perspective. He's currently a clinical research fellow and a psychotherapy supervisor at Yale, my alma mater, which is kind of cool. But he's worked on the Hopkins NYU study, or he's working on the Hopkins NYU study of giving psilocybin to religious leaders. Very interesting. He's worked extensively on researching and thinking about the results of the NYU psilocybin anxiety end-of-life cancer patient study, and in so doing, thinking very hard about what is mystical experience, what's the difference and the similarities between psychedelic experience and non-psychedelic mystical experience. What are the actual transforming factors that people are talking about? How do we think about what they're saying? How do we do all this? So that's super cool. And then he's starting he's participating in the start of a whole clinical research training center in New York City called Nautilus Sanctuary. They're doing some very interesting thinking about how to scale and take forward psychedelic therapy. And it's, it's everybody's playing their game now. I mean, it's moving so fast, and there's some really clear thinking that they have about how to change some of the operating principles of how to do psychedelic therapy in ways that look forward to, again, a scalable world where there's more accessibility, and there's ways of folding in non-professional people into the process, dealing with integration as part of the process. So we'll be talking about some of that stuff as well. Anyway, with no further ado, Alex, so much for joining me on Expanding Mind.
Eric, thank you for having me. It's a real delight to be here.
Well, one of the things I got a real gas out of when I wrote to you, I was like, I meet a fair number of researchers and clinicians these days, and I know some of them have been around the block for a long time, but a lot of people, they come from their own currents into this work, and they're not often that hep. And you're like, yeah, didn't I see you at Mind States in 2001, which is like super OG underground fringe psychedelic conference world? And I was like, oh my God, this guy's great.
Well, that was the only psychedelic conference that was happening in the early aughts. There was nothing else to be had. It was funny because I remembered when you reached out to me, I was like, Eric, I think I saw Eric almost 20 years ago give a talk. So it's good to close the loop here a little bit. Absolutely.
I mean, but it also tells me that you've been interested in these things, thinking about these things, presumably exploring them to whatever degree was appropriate. Outside or initial, that your research came really out of very deeply held interests for a long time.
Yeah, I think that it's been one of the formative parts of becoming a career psychologist and professional in the field. I got into psychedelics young enough in the late 90s in college that I was able to take some advice about how to think about how to build a career of meaningful work around this topic. And, I was interested in getting professional credentials and studying in the academy, and those tools and that way of thinking has been incredibly helpful. But I appreciate the sort of off-the-wall queering discourses that happened around psychedelics because they really challenge us to ask deeper, penetrating questions about what's actually happening with the medicine work, the clinical practice, and the sort of sociological implications of what it means for there to be a quote-unquote renaissance in psychedelic medicine. And I think we're really on the cusp of something that is going to shift a lot of boundaries in the next few years. It's already happening so quickly, as you put it.
Yeah, and I really, it's just a great relief for me to hear someone who's really working in the clinical and research field, who isn't necessarily one of the the elders, but someone who's you're just the kind of first flush of your career, and you're thinking about these sociological, aesthetic, weird, spiritual questions, not in a formulaic way. Sometimes we hear about the spiritual aspect or the spiritual experience, and it almost becomes instrumentalized. It becomes almost like a mechanical process that has to do with this pill that we can just sort of farm it out, and then we're going to get these solutions. And that, in a way, that's a little bit of inevitability in just the whole clinical approach, especially when it's trying to go out into the world and create, sustainable businesses and treat real people in our, given situation. But it also feels like it's really important to keep kind of asking the questions that you're doing. And so I'd love to hear from your research. You've co-written a number of papers, but maybe starting with the work that you've done looking at the end of life anxiety with cancer patients and how psilocybin is working there, and how did learning more about how these people were experiencing their psilocybin trip, how it was integrating, how it was changing their attitudes, their emotions, their feelings about the future, about death. How did that sort of open up this question of these deeper implications of what it means to be introducing more and more people to psychedelic experience?
One of the reasons, and we borrowed largely from Dr. Charlie Grob at UCLA, who really began the research with psilocybin to treat people with end-of-life existential distress and cancer diagnosis. And then Hopkins and NYU continued some of that work. There had been a long history of working with psychedelics in the 50s and 60s with people with end-of-life distress and issues. I mean, the two largest indications in the 50s and 60s were around alcoholism, substance use disorders, and then people dealing with cancer and end-of-life distress that was carried through the Spring Grove work into the 70s. And, it seemed like a good fit. And we were looking at clinically elevated anxiety and depression. It's no surprise that people facing end-of-life issues are going to deal with some increased symptomatology around these matters. And it's no surprise that we're going to have some difficulty with that. We know that this conversations around death, the confrontation with death, is one of the most avoided conversations in medicine. Most medical residents and psychiatrists don't deal with it very well. And in my field, in clinical psychology, it's not really part of our training oftentimes. And so you have the double injury of having a life-threatening diagnosis, and the second injury of having to go through the medical regimen around it, a chemotherapy, radiation, sort of the ongoing onslaught of dealing with the medical profession, which sometimes can be good and healing and is oftentimes destabilizing and difficult, without necessarily a psychospiritual framework or a sociological relational support mechanism to help you understand what's happening. We, in this study, it was a double-blind, placebo-controlled study. And, what I'll do is just sort of highlight some of what we found, and then sort of talk a little bit about your question around, what the meaning of it was for the participants, because I had the opportunity to interview in depth our participants in multi-hour interviews to really get at what happened for them in the room.
Great.
So we were measuring anxiety and depression. We treated 29 people in our room, which was off of First Avenue in Manhattan. Potentially not the ideal place you could imagine in a busy Manhattan's dense urban setting. But we found a beautiful room, and we set it up with living plants and natural objects of wood and stone. And we asked participants to go into their own deep experience. So we asked them to close their eyes. We encouraged them to wear eye shades and to listen to music, and not to be, quote unquote, distracted with external stimuli, but to go into their own inner experience. And this was in a room with two psychotherapists with whom they had developed a deep and trusting rapport. So they had lots of psychotherapy before, during, and after, so that they weren't just going into a room with two strangers. They were really connected with their therapy team. And what we found was really quite astounding in the sense that we had rates of, this is a crossover design, so we had two arms, people who received psilocybin and people who received an active placebo. And the people having anxiety, the anxiety rates reduced from 58% down to 14%, and depression from 83% down to 14%. So our response rates were in the 60 to 80% range. This is, active treatment versus placebo. So we had, active treatment went significantly down. And we had similar experiences to what people had reported even in the quote-unquote healthy normal trials that Hopkins did, which is that 70% of our participants said that they had the single or among the top 5 most meaningful experiences of their lives in our little treatment room on First Avenue. 87% of participants said that their life satisfaction and well-being increased. And we had a variety of other things that changed over the course of this treatment for people. People reported that they felt less demoralized about their experience of cancer or of life-threatening illness. They felt increased hopelessness. Their sense of spirituality and depth of spirituality improved and increased. Their feelings of well-being and peace and meaning also increased. And curiously, people reported that they felt more altruistic, that they actually felt like they were able to or had a greater capacity to give back to their family, friends, and communities in important and meaningful ways. And this is after just one experience with psilocybin. So it really raised a lot of pretty big questions for us. Now, my passion has been in mixed methods and qualitative research, because I think that we're really at the beginning of understanding what it is that giving people powerful medicines like psilocybin or MDMA might engender. And so we embarked upon a program of long form, in-depth, semi-structured, largely unstructured interviews with the patients in our trial. And people just reported the most amazing things about their spiritual experiences. And it got me really curious, and maybe we'll get to this later, about the nature of what it was that's causing the change. In psychology, we call this the mechanism of action, right? So you give somebody a substance, what are the pathways by which their healing or transformation occurs? And there could be multiple pathways, right? Like potentially things like these psilocybin and other classic, quote unquote, classic serotonergic hallucinogens. There might be multiple neurophysiological pathways that might help cause the difference we see in depression rates or anxiety rates post-treatment. It's anti-inflammatory, it's active at the serotonergic system. But what we find across the literature, and we found this in our study too, was that people experienced what we were able to code or score as an intense religious, spiritual, or mystical experience using the MEQ, a questionnaire around their mystical experience. And we find that when people had a very strong religious or spiritual experience in the trial, that score predicted their improvements in symptoms or clinical symptoms afterward. And so this is sort of the reigning or leading explanation of the psychological mechanism of action, that people have some sort of black box experience, something happens for them, it seems quite profound, and then they get better afterward, and they get better in a variety of different domains. I was interested in entering into that black box a little bit with them. So we asked them about, all manner of their experience, what they found. And, what we found was that rarely did people have like a complete white light experience. And we can talk about what that means later, a sort of non-dual experience, if to use a particular type of theological or religious discourse language. But what we did find was that people had many of the things that you would expect. They had profound, colorful visions, people having visions of visiting Gaudi cathedrals, people visiting vast plains of landscape, rivers being visited by guiding spirits, by visitations from dead loved ones, from living people in their lives. The majority of the people I interviewed met their members of their family on their journey. They met their mother or father, whether alive or deceased, their children, loved ones. And oftentimes those loved ones took the form of guiding spirits, like Virgil for Dante in the Divine Comedy. They helped guide them in some way through the journey. And so their experiences and visions were very colorful. They were synesthetic in many ways. They were also profoundly about the body. So this was not something that just happened in the realm of thought. People had experiences of feeling like they were in a cloud forest and they could feel the vapor and the wet of the cloud as it moved against their bare forearm. They actually felt water vapor in their forearm. They could listen to the music and have a really rich synesthetic experience of the music in their body. But these are also cancer patients. So we had people who had profound anxiety about cancer recurrence, about tumors in their testicles, in their abdomen, in their breasts. And we had a small number of people who had physical experiences where they felt like they were aware of, or they perceived either the cancer or their fear or hatred of the cancer as a sort of black mass in their body. I had one young man who said that he felt like through the psilocybin experience, he was able to powerfully eject, like push out this black cloud mass that had occupied his body. And it came out like a mushroom cloud, like an atomic explosion. And it left him in some way. And he found that profound expulsion of the fear of cancer from the body to be liberating or relieving in some important way. And since then, he has reported that he no longer has to anxiously check or be worried about recurrence of cancer.
What's interesting right there, what just pops in my head is just how there you have almost because as a religious scholar, someone who knows a lot about visionary experiences and religious experiences around the world, there's all these resonances, and so clearly we're talking about something that is in the same general domain as what we would call religious or mystical experiences without psychedelics. But in that particular case, there's a much more kind of concrete connection where there's so much of shamanic healing involves the kind of performed story of masses in the body that can be sucked out or pulled out, scraped away. This kind of sense that by materializing the affect, the emotion, or the fear in this case, there's a sort of way of handling that within the kind of opened up body, the psychedelic body. And it's a really great example of how, which is I think one of the things you're talking about, is just how wide the range of experiences that had religious or mystical import for people. But when you get down to the nitty gritty of what they were like, they're happening in all sorts of domains and dimensions with the body, in relationship, in nature, and sometimes in a non-dual sense of oneness with all reality. And my impression from your writings about this work is that diversity is one of the things that you really came away from this qualitative study.
I was interested in the diversity of the experience. So one of the problems with our methods right now is that like somebody who loses their keys and then searches under the light, we only know what we measure in any of these clinical research studies. And I think that we've done our best oftentimes to put, when you write a clinical protocol, it's a 100-page document, and you throw in as many assessments as you can without trying to burden the participants with an onslaught of questionnaires. But we don't necessarily measure all the things. And so the diversity of experience has been really difficult. And some of the findings that I think that we're getting, not just in the cancer trial, but also in the religious professionals studies. This is a study of religious leaders. These are people who don't have any clinical diagnosis of any sort. They don't have cancer. They're otherwise healthy individuals, but they are priests, clerics, imams, that Zen teachers that have made their life and livelihood pursuing a serious faith or wisdom tradition, and they're making their living and their livelihood doing that in their religious communities. This is a study at NYU headed by Dr. Tony Bossis and Dr. Stephen Ross, and also at our sister site at Hopkins in Baltimore. We see similar themes emerging. I'm interviewing these professionals in their field, and they frequently have experiences. I mean, you use the shamanic body or the psychedelic body, but these are deeply embedded, embodied experiences. And they're the physical soma of the body, not just in terms of the traumas that may be kept in the body, memory that may be kept in the body, the concretization of thoughts, affect, or feelings that are somehow materialized or made more concrete, that are in a way that's able to process through the psychedelic experience. These experiences are profound and incredibly important, but also embedded in relationships. I mean, literally embedded in relationships with people that appear to people in their psilocybin experiences, but embedded in the relationships of the person who drops them off at the clinic in the morning and picks them up at night, the way that they tell and narrate their story to friends and loved ones afterward, including the clinical team, the therapists that they're in a deep relationship with. They're doing some really heavy lifting, right, in the room. And those sort of connected human relational experiences seem like powerful spiritual mediators for people. You know, these are not, I think there's been a sort of pull to understand the individual in an atomistic way, right? The lone yogi on the mountaintop who has a divine revelation of some sort, or some attainment to spiritual knowing or enlightenment, as being a solo journey. And again and again, that particular framework seems to be repudiated by this experience, what we're hearing from participants in this experience.
Well, it feels like here we're getting towards, you know, the some of the topic that you're going to be talking about at Queering Psychedelics, and it has to do with the way that a certain idea of what mystical experience is, you know, came about historically. It had to do with Aldous Huxley. It had to do with the ideas that we call perennialism, basically with non-dual or impersonal ideas of achieving oneness with the Godhead, or the identity of the soul with the universal. And that this very specific development in the, you know, starting in the early 20th century, for various historical reasons, becomes like the central model of psychedelic experience, so that especially when people are claiming religious or mystical experience on psychedelics, it tends to be organized along these lines. And that while there's, you know, phenomenological reasons to talk about that, and that this is a noble current in the history of the world's wisdom traditions, it's also profoundly distorting. And I, you know, love to hear some more detail on this, because you've worked much more closely with the actual questionnaires. But my understanding is that the MEQ that you mentioned, which is the kind of de facto, or, you know, the reigning questionnaire to determine what a quote unquote mystical experience is, it rests on work in religious studies and spiritual psychology that's from the 1960s. That's very easy as a historian to go, yeah, that's not, no, that's kind of a problem. No, actually, that doesn't withstand critical thinking at this point, at least in the history of religious studies. So when I remember when I met Roland Griffiths, I tried to talk to him about this. I was like, Roland, that stuff's all great. Like, yes, all of those features of this questionnaire are real things that happen to people, and they clearly have to do with what we mean by mystical experience. But there's so much else that's loaded into that model, and there's so much that's ignored, that it's really actually distorting, I believe, our ideas of what religious experience is, what mystical experience is, what is important about psychedelic experience. Like, oh, you didn't have a
unity trip? You didn't have a ego dissolving oneness with the universe trip. You instead you talked to animals, or you remembered your mom, or you walked down a corridor, or you felt energies moving in your body. Well, maybe next time, kid. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you've really worked with these questionnaires, with people's experience, and I sense from the topic of your talk at the upcoming conference that you also have some real questions about how we think about, and particularly how we, map and sort of concretize ideas about mystical experience in ways that have to do with how we think about these experiences.
Yeah, so there's part of the problem with studying psychedelics is that the topic is so multidisciplinary that it's difficult for any one person to feel like they have sufficient training, background, and expertise to really tackle any one question. And so it's really an amazingly collaborative endeavor. When you're a psychologist, if you find a measure that works and is predictive of outcome, then great, stick with it. But I think it does really flatten. So let me just try to outline this, and I'll be talking in greater depth. But the current sort of psychospiritual religious explanation is that people have a profound experience. We can measure it using this questionnaire, the Mystical Experience Questionnaire. And the problem, I think there's a few problems with that. And I want to forward 4 basic critiques. And I call these critiques a theistic critique, a nature mysticism critique, and then as a queer person, I want to mount a queer critique, and this is sort of bound up with feminist and criticalist critiques around power, the body, intersectionality. And then fourthly, make a methodological critique. So I don't want to get too heady, and maybe I'll just sort of summarize, but I think that one of the problems is that I think, Eric, in one of our previous discussions, you described this as these lesser experiences that people often report, even in underground settings or ayahuasca circles. But we see this in some of our psilocybin trials. The quote unquote lesser experiences there's an implied hierarchy of religious or mystical experience, and that the crown, for many people, is a sort of non-dual, formless, shapeless, odorless, colorless experience. The crown jewel would be the Advaita, sort of Vedanta experience, or what Huxley called the perennial philosophy. And anything beneath that, or seemingly beneath that, is on a lower rung, or somewhere, as the person treks up the mountainside, but it's not actually the peak. And it assumes a sort of idea that of monistic mysticism, that mysticism is one, and that there may be multiple roads, but eventually we're leading to one attainment or one realization. And of course, a lot of the work and the current measure is based upon the work of W.T. Stace. And Stace was a scholar of religion in the 60s, and much of the questionnaire that he put together that we use today in our measures, even now in 2019, are based upon interviews with people who had these sorts of experiences, either in the West, in the Christian tradition, or in Vedanta non-dual philosophies. And the problem with that, one of the problems with that, is that it's a highly etic tradition, meaning you're taking a questionnaire that was developed with a completely different population, with a completely different, potentially different set of experiences, and then just wholesale picking it up and plunking it down into the psychedelic experience, and hoping that what you measure actually measures what's the underlying phenomenon that's going on. And it's not emic. An emic would be a bottom-up rather than a top-down way of developing a measure. And so the best practice in psychology is to use an emic measure, which is that you do the hard labor of interviewing people, you do the hard labor of understanding the variants and the general themes that arise, and then you design questions to try to understand how to measure the underlying constructs of what's going on. It might be one construct, and the MEQ sort of measures a few different constructs leading towards this non-dual prioritized spiritual experience. But we see again and again that Stace says things like, these are lesser experiences. He calls them hocus pocus, or mystery mongering, quote unquote mystery mongering. And so he's not really honoring the intermediate or beginning states as he undersaw them of people who experience in their psychedelic visions. And so, there's a variety of critiques we can make around that. I mean, the first one, of course, is that people often have an experience with a vision of a god, a spirit, an angel, an entity in the sort of DMT discourse, some other being, which seems to have access or embodies a type of wisdom. It could even be the person's higher, an embodiment of their own self, highest self. And this sort of theistic experience of an encounter, the encounter moment, is seen as a lesser experience. And yet we consistently see this in psychedelic experience that people
here I can't help but interrupt, because what's so fascinating is that that very problem runs through the history of how we think about mysticism. So setting aside psychedelics, it's one of the great questions. Now, I suspect you am essentially a pluralist. I think that mysticism is many things, that there are many mountains, that mountaintops may all resonate with one another, but you don't get there the same way, and they don't even necessarily look the same way, and nor should we expect them to. I respect unity consciousness. I've tasted it on occasion. I respect the earnestness and desire to have a language of unity, but I think that it really obscures this kind of pluralism. And the most obvious example of that is when you try to say that mysticism is ultimately on one scale, that we all have within us the potential for mystical experience, and that regardless of our religion, it ultimately takes the same form. You have at the very peak this problem. Is it a unitive experience, or is it an experience of relationship with God? And, for various historical reasons, I'm more familiar with and resonant with the former, but the latter is also part of my own experience, and certainly an incredibly rich part of the literature. So if you're looking at this, you're going, what does it mean to say that a Christian mystic who has this personal encounter with God in this absolutely phenomenologically bizarre and wondrous and transformative way is somehow, wait, that's down this ladder? Like, what level is that? And then you're like, what is the point of this ladder? Like, can we just get rid of the ladder here and try to have like a multiplicity of possibilities? So even before we even talk about psychedelics, this issue is a knot in the ideas that people have about mysticism.
Yeah, and I think that and I just want to underscore that I have my own background and history here, but we do our best. I earnestly try to do my best to use the language and the words that our own participants are using to make sense of their own experience. And so we see this repeatedly in how they talk about their experience, which is that, the second critique I might make is one around nature mysticism. So if you look at the paintings of Luis Eduardo Luna, who painted in the ayahuasca tradition, they're profoundly colorful. They have sound and vision and color and animals and Icaros, and this works on Mendel Kalin's work around music. These experiences of the three worlds, of ancestors, of animal spirits, are really completely not measured in our current sort of assessment paradigm. But people experience them, and I think that we should be asking these questions and measuring them. Maria Sabina's vision and the way that she spoke about her training and experience of the mushroom spirits is vastly inconsistent with a monistic theology. And in the Christian tradition, we see other women leaders in the area, like Evelyn Underhill's work on mysticism in the Christian tradition. Oftentimes these are relational experiences or theistic experiences that are poo-pooed or discounted in some way by the idea that the apprehensiveness of the one is the only attainable, the only goal to attain. And as Stace put it, the rest are borderline cases. And I think that it challenges us in a variety of ways to think more broadly about how to understand what's deeply happening for people.
Yeah, and here I just want to interrupt and sort of ask you to talk about that from the queer perspective, which is one of your other points of view, is that how does this problem in the fetishizing essentially of a certain model of unitive experience as being the ultimate goal, and if you do, somehow everything else that happens is lesser, how that also creates a particular problem from queer identity, queer experience from that angle.
Yeah, I've been having, in anticipation of this upcoming Queering Psychedelics conference in San Francisco in a couple of weeks, I've been having a lot of conversations, and some of my thinking about queer spiritualities, and I define those in a plural way, come from really helpful conversations I've had with my friends and colleague Nick Mendoza at Harvard, Jay Michelson here in New York and Brooklyn. And the question is, like, what is a queer spirituality? How do we understand queer experience? I mean, one of the problems with not just psychedelic research broadly, but clinical research across the board, is that we tend not to even ask people, are you queer? Are you LGBTQ? What gender identifications and your sexual identity and orientations? So we don't actually know at baseline, in a real fundamental way, whether or not what we're doing, mostly for straight individuals or cisgender individuals, works for gender nonconforming people, trans folks, and queer folks. So that's big problem number one. And I will say there's been some movement on that. I mean, in the MAPS, I'm a study therapist, and the MAPS phase 3 study of MDMA as a assisted psychotherapy as a treatment for PTSD. And in the large multi-site trial they're running now, that we are asking people, and I think they will be running sub-analyses to look at their gender identity and their sexual orientation, which I think is critical. When it comes to the spirituality question, it gets a little, the critique gets a little bit richer. And, well, first of all, queer spirituality and the radical fairy tradition. I think that, Eric, I know you were talking about the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, which informs much of what's happened at Burning Man. A lot of this movement is rooted in a specific historical power experience around the plague years of the 80s and 90s. And so the queer spirituality is bound up with this sort of experience of not only the body, the sick body with AIDS, but also the reclamation of the body in terms of reclaiming queer sexual energy, reclaiming a sense of pleasure and joy in physical touch and practice with one another, reclaiming a sense of community and family of choice rather than family of origin, especially for many individuals who grew up in families that were highly rejecting. And we see across the board for queer folks that the highly disproportionate rates, or rates that are 2 to 3 times our straight counterparts, of higher than average rates for depression, anxiety, substance use disorders, post-traumatic stress. And consistently, the research shows that is not due or traceable to the person being a sexual minority or gender minority person. That is due to the extra stress, the sexual minority stress, the gender minority stress, that is part of structural homophobia and structural transphobia in the environment. A lifetime of additional messages of being inferior, experiences of discrimination, victimization, stigma, messages to hate oneself, messages of shame. These take a toll on the physical body in terms of cortisol studies that look at the actual burden of stress on the body, and in terms of the symptoms that queer folks experience. And so when you look at queer spirituality, especially in regards to medicine, we see measures that aren't necessarily looking at some of these more deeply embodied and related measures. And we also see a sort of lack of a social justice paradigm, or a lack of a political critique throughout the research. And I think that there's potentially very good reason for that, but the queer spirituality movement is deeply bound up with queer liberation, the queer liberation movement, which is an inherently political movement. I mean, we're coming up upon the 50th anniversary of Stonewall. I live in New York City, and the primary march in the city has become largely a corporatist parade, where we have Coors Light and other big corporate sponsors coming through, and Goldman Sachs coming through to sponsor floats. And there's not really a sense of community ownership. But groups like the Radical Fairies and other largely more marginal groups that have a deeper community root and a deeper sort of sense of spiritual embodiment in their practices are trying to reclaim this sort of public tradition. And I think yeah, go ahead.
Well, one thing that just brings up for me is the tension in modern queer political movements, liberation movements, between assimilationist and radical positions. Goes all the way back. You look at the Mattachine Society and Harry Hay, and there's already, you see these tensions, and they just keep kind of iterating themselves. And at certain periods in time, the more radical possibilities lead the way in the early 70s, let's say, and then at other points. More recently, the kind of assimilationist, or whatever you want to call the kind of point where, no, we're just like everybody else. We want marriage. We want to have kids. We want to just reproduce the social norm. And, that's fine for some people. It's not a critique of people who just want to, be let alone and live their lives however they choose to live their lives. I don't have any problem with that, or getting, officially married or whatever. But the radicalism of queer history and of queer possibility, which is, a radicalism that everybody's got to deal with because it's intense, it's challenging. It's like a different way of thinking about love, about the body, about, like gender binaries, like in so many religious traditions where there's an essential feminine and an essential man. What do we do with, queerness there? What do we do with gender fuck and those kind of structures? They're really radical. And so one thing that I'm really excited about this conversation about queering psychedelics is it seems to me that some of those radical elements are tied in with this question of queer spirituality in a really deep way, such that by asking these questions, we're able to get at some of these radical possibilities and challenges and creative expressions at a time when it feels like the assimilationist side has been more successful or more visible in modern society. I don't know if
Yeah, Eric, and everything you said about the tension historically between a radicalist versus an assimilationist tradition, I think you could have said the same thing for the story of psychedelics, right? So I think in the sense that I think that there are important lessons that we can learn in the psychedelic research field and the way in which our political discourses are shaped by these tensions that are in many ways parallel to the tradition around assimilationism versus radicalism. And I use radicalism in terms of like a power critique rather than, and a sort of reclamation of the more marginal aspects of not just identities, but the parts of ourselves that have been cast aside or disowned, disavowed. And so for example, like, I think you're going to give a bit of a talk on this, but, queer leaders in the psychedelic movement, from Burroughs and Ginsberg to Ram Dass, like Ram Dass really struggled with coming out of the closet, right, as somebody who was attracted to men. And so it seemed almost like it was easier to come out in a time, and I get into sort of arguments with people around the use of the word coming out of the closet as not just a gay person, a queer person, but people use that language to talk about their experience of coming out as being into psychedelics. And, I think there's something to be said for the intersectional nature of the psychedelic and the queer experiences. So I was at a Radical Fairy gathering recently at Beltane, which is a spring festival where you wrap the ribbons of your intention around a maypole in community with other people. And as you weave your intentions together, you are creating not only an individual, but a group cohesion tension around the axis mundi of the world and your intentions for the new year. And a leader in that community said, our magic is intersectional. the people at that gathering, like many psychedelic gatherings, come from multiple different spiritual and faith traditions. It's not coming out of just one lineage. So you'll get a conference together, like the upcoming Queering Psychedelics conference, or really any gathering of interested, curious seekers at a psychedelic gathering, or even researchers, and they come from different religious and spiritual backgrounds across multiple faith traditions. There's an intersectional nature to this, which is not, the lineage is not deeply held in one particular linear stream, which is handed down from father to son, from mother to daughter, from parent to child, but is rather individuals sort of come up out of families as queer, or come up out of families as potentially interested in psychedelics. And those, they're oftentimes bringing their own richness and background into the melee, right? For better and for worse, oftentimes causing significant controversy, but it's also, like places like Burning Man, a bit of a meeting of the minds, like a real intersection, a road of different lineages coming together. And I think that that's potentially quite powerful.
Yeah, it really, one thing you said that I hadn't thought about before, that's exciting is the relationship with the family. That just as queer people in modern world often have to leave their family, even to kind of turn away from them, at least at some points in their life, and find a new family in order to be accepted and to be affirmed, that there's something about that in religion too, that you know, a traditional religion is of course very patriarchal. It's very much, you know, passed down, or even some indigenous traditions, it's very much clearly passed down through this sort of organic family, you know, localized structure. But if you have to go outside of that, you're going to create not only different kinds of families, but you're also creating different kinds of religions that are more open to that sort of nomadic, rekindling, retribalization. And you see that retribalization very strongly, at least in the psychedelic culture that I know, that one of the things that attracted to me to the psychedelic culture back in the Mind States days and in the earlier days of Burning Man, I can't really speak for it these days, was precisely this sense of a real desire to find new ways of coming together in family-like or tribal-like groups. And in that way, it seems like there's a real similarity with other sorts of folks, you know, like all the people who've come to San Francisco over the last 50, 60 years to find a new tribe, both because they're queer, or they're, you know, sexual minorities, or gender minorities, whatever, and you know, freaks of all sorts. So there isn't real intimacy there. But I wanted to ask you, do you have trouble with the mapping of coming out as a term onto psychedelics as well as queerness?
Huge controversy. You know, I think that actually my friend and colleague Nashe Devaneux has thought a lot about this as a non-queer person who finds the term useful. I personally find it helpful. I think it's a helpful metaphor. I don't think that queer people necessarily own the closet, although I wouldn't want it to be. I think you have to be very careful when using that term. So the closet's a cultural construct, right? And oftentimes we put the burden on young queer people to quote unquote come out of the closet. Like, oh, I don't want to ask this 12-year-old boy if he's attracted to other boys because he'll come around to it in his own time. But in doing so, the walls of the closet are constructed from the outside in. The lack of interest, the lack of asking people about that is an actual way that the wall and the doors to the closet are kept high and shut. And so in many ways, the cultural construct around the closet in the psychedelic tradition, which is like, you know, even as a researcher, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Talk about your own psychedelic experience. You're damned if you do, because if you do, you're no longer "quote unquote" an objective researcher who doesn't have a horse in the race because you've been skewed subjectively by one's own experience with medicine. And you're damned if you don't, because if you have never taken the medicine, how can you possibly understand and do, important clinical work, or even be a therapist in a trial where people are taking this medicine. Obviously, in the indigenous and many shamanic traditions, you have to undergo significant personal training in order to hold and carry and offer the medicine to others. And so, the closet around psychedelics is the shame and stigma around being queer is not unlike the shame and stigma of coming out of the closet and telling your boyfriend, girlfriend, partner that you are interested in psychedelic medicine, telling your colleagues, your friends, your family of origin that you've had an important psychedelic experience and it's opened up a lot for you and you're trying to integrate it in some important way. And the secrecy and not only the legal structure, but the secrecy around psychedelic journey work, I think is often what it is a factor in the unnecessary additional harms that are often caused by them. And from a harm reduction perspective, I think it would help us as a culture to understand more open, compassionate, and affirming ways for people to learn with each other how to safely take these medicines with guidance, facilitation, and to have them be embedded in cultural practices rather than somebody ordering something off of the internet and taking it alone in their bedroom, which is truly one of the worst settings I can imagine for a novice person who doesn't have experience with this sort of work.
Yeah. Well, that's a wonderful segue to talking about Nautilus Sanctuary, this clinical research training site you're developing. But unfortunately, we're out of time. And I had a feeling that was going to happen. But I want to mention that you're also just working on these issues on the ground in terms of how, again, we can scale these issues. I just wonder, we have like a minute left. If there's, of all the things that we're talking about, particularly the politics involved, what is the one improvement or change that you're working on at Nautilus that you think is the most significant in terms of this issue of diversity and accessibility?
I think that at Nautilus, I'm working with a team of 8 clinicians, and we are asking the hard question: how do you take a highly expensive treatment that was designed to maximize clinical efficacy and make it accessible to people? And that involves running groups largely. And I think that group practice is powerful in and of its own right. It also happens to lower the cost barrier so that people who don't have means or access or privilege might be able to access these medicines in a way that is more financially sustainable for the providers, but also the people who are coming to seek treatment. And there's a variety of ways of doing that, and we hope to answer those questions. And it's going to be an amazing ride in the next decade. I'm excited to see where it goes.
Well, I look forward to talking to you again. Thanks again, Alex, for talking with us on Expanding Mind.
Eric, thank you so much for having me. I look forward to your next iteration and seeing you in San Francisco in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, that's great. It's going to be fun. Again, Queering Psychedelics is the first weekend in June here in San Francisco. Until next week, keep your minds open.